Oh, look, they're posing the press out. That's great. They're T-posing on the press. T-posing. So we're out here today in front of the White House, I believe protesting to impeach Trump. I think you have a sign over here. It says, "All roads with Trump lead to Putin."
That guy's one of the trolls, right? Yeah, I do. Okay. Right here? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Was there a problem, sir? No.
Not talk right now.
Okay, are you sure? Was it something I said? All right, come on. Washington, D.C. Behind me, we have the White House and then some protesters. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you're out here, what it means for you to be out here?
Yeah, I came from Salt Lake City today to D.C. and the White House to show our support for a Green New Deal and really changing the way this country is run to take care of the planet instead of be destroying it.
Absolutely. I know the Green New Deal has a ton of very progressive ideas written on it. It has like housing for all, Medicare for all, trying to get to net zero emissions. Do you think the things on the Green New Deal are feasible or kind of just like a progressive wish list?
They're completely feasible. Right now, with, I believe it's in the teens% of the Pentagon's budget, we could put solar and wind to power every single house in this country.
Absolutely. I know AOC also talks about getting to net zero within 10 years. Again, do you think like that's a feasible goal for us to try to be going after?
Everything's feasible. You see in the 60s, they said we put a person on the moon, and we did that. If we want to do it, we can. It's just changing what our priorities are.
Yeah. So I've attended a few different climate change events like the climate strike and things like that. Many of these children and many of the leaders have a very Malthusian view. Some people are saying not to have children or things like that. Some people are saying we only have 10 years left. What do you think about people saying not to have kids, maybe that we only have 10 years left? And do you think we only have, 10 or so years left?
I think it depends on what we do right now at this point in time. And it's a very blessed to be in this point in time where we can really make a difference. So we have to make that difference.
So we're out here today beside the White House. We have some impeach Trump and then climate protesters to our right. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you're out here and what it means for you to be out here?
Well, I actually flew in from SF for the week-long Remove Trump protests. So I've been here since Wednesday, and this just happened to coincide. So I'm here for both causes, really.
Nice. What are your biggest qualms about Trump? I know people have been talking about Russiagate, there's Stormy Daniels, there's the taxes stuff, there's Ukrainegate. I'm sure I'm missing a few. But, what's your major problem with Trump, maybe policy-wise?
Policy-wise?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I know people talk about, his rhetoric, people talk about his tweets, but then
yeah.
when it comes to the bare bones about it, what does he do that really, maybe like a Muslim ban, there's a ton of...
Yeah. I mean, the Muslim ban was kind of the first one that really set me off, but he doesn't have policies is the main policy. He thinks of things on the fly and then just tweets it, and that's supposed to be like our national policy. That's not how things work.
Yeah. I know one of the things he recently did that he got a lot of pushback for was pulling troops out of North Syria. Do you have any qualms about pulling our troops out of North Syria? Because sometimes people sound for it, but then they attack Trump for it. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, of course I have qualms. I mean, we abandoned our allies in the region and basically set everything on fire. Like, the Kurds are getting killed by Erdogan. So yeah, obviously. Yeah. Obviously I want the troops to come home. I'm against war and things like that, but there's a way to do it that doesn't totally screw everybody else in the region.
Absolutely.
We have to finish what we started.
Yeah. And as far as impeachment goes, I know it sounds like they have the right amount of people, a supermajority in the House to impeach, but maybe not a supermajority in the Senate to remove.
Yeah.
Do you still want Democrats to proceed in the House even though they might not be successful in the Senate?
Yes. I think we've been kind of complacent and silent for way too long. And even if it's just a symbolic gesture at this point, it needs to be done, and we need to show people that we're not just going to roll over and let Republicans do whatever they want.
Yeah. Trump supporters say that many Democrats are only seeking to impeach Trump now because they don't think there's a Democrat that could beat him in 2020. Do you think that holds any weight? And then who would you support in 2020 to take him out?
No, I don't think that holds any weight at all. I think there's actually a few candidates who have a pretty good shot at beating him. I personally support Elizabeth Warren. I think she has the most comprehensive policies. I really like Bernie, but I just am leaning more towards her. I want a woman in the White House. I want somebody a little bit younger. Yeah. We need to get him out.
Yeah, I know there's not a civil war, but been some qualms in the Democrat Party with the moderates and then the more progressives. Okay. Would you support somebody like a Joe Biden if he was the eventual Democrat nominee?
I wouldn't be too happy about it, but yeah, obviously, like, if Trump ends up being the candidate, it doesn't matter for the Republicans. It doesn't matter who the Democrat ends up being. I will support them and vote for them.
Last question.
Sure. Oh, good.
I know that Trump was talking about a lot of the Ukraine stuff because Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, was on some exec board there making $50K a month.
Sure.
Do you have any qualms about a potential conflict of interest there? Is there any there with that, or do you think that's really just a red herring in the conversation?
I mean, I think Trump is really good at distracting from his own issues and things that he's doing. I'm not super familiar with the whole Biden situation, specifically, like his son. Obviously, I'm against, like, if he's getting money for nefarious reasons or whatever. Like, just because he's a Democrat doesn't mean we owe him any support. If he's doing something wrong, it's wrong. But that doesn't also mean that Trump is not wrong.
Absolutely. So it's because I've heard Democrats talk about it, and it seems like the soft corruption that some Democrats are comfortable with, but it's nice to see people rail against it.
Trump trolls, just so you know.
I hope you didn't think any of my questions were ridiculous. I was going to ask in conclusion, was there anything else you want to mention?
Fuck Trump.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. I really
Sure.
appreciate it. So we're out here today. Behind us, we have the White House, and then we're with some Impeach Trump protesters, but it's also a climate change event. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you're out here and what it means for you to be out here?
I came out because I was informed that November 8th, as part of Fire Drill Fridays, was going to focus on the connection between climate chaos and militarism. That's why I'm here.
Absolutely.
A lot of the people in the climate movement are not making that connection. The Pentagon is #1 at Ecocide. All you have to do is look at how much fuel the Pentagon uses just on a daily basis. They're #1. If the climate movement doesn't make that connection, we're not going to solve climate chaos. So that's why I'm here today. I'm not surprised that they didn't want to arrest us. We had celebrities here today. But there'll be many, many other opportunities to risk arrest. I'm not here to get arrested. I'm here to try to make that message that we got to take on the Pentagon if we're really, really serious.
So what is it? Reduce the size of our military is essentially the goal?
Oh, absolutely. Sure. You got to cut the military budget. I come from Baltimore, Maryland, and I can take you to schools where some of schools don't have air conditioning. Some of the schools don't have heating. I can take you to drug treatment centers that are desperate. Sure. I can take you to areas of Baltimore where we have 300 homicides a year. All of that is, in my opinion, a consequence because 64% of the discretionary budget is going to war.
Sure. Discretionary budget, good phrasing specifically, because in our non-discretionary spending, then it's only like a fraction. It only cuts down to around like 15%. But discretionary spending, yes.
And part of that discretionary spending is the interest on the national debt. Sure. And that interest on the national debt comes from all of the wars that have been waged.
Yeah. Can I ask you one thing? I know recently Trump pulled out some troops from northern Syria. Some people gave him flack, some people supported it. So what did you think of Trump's move to pull out troops from northern Syria?
Trump betrayed the Kurdish people. There's no doubt about it. He said he's pulling out anybody that fell for that is ridiculous because at the very
Do you think he
time,
is or isn't pulling out then?
Well, first of all, he sent troops to Saudi Arabia. Figure that one out. And then also he sent troops in to protect our oil. Our oil. This is Syrian oil. It was a betrayal. The Kurds have lost a minimum of 11,000 people. And this includes a lot of women, because everyone knows that the women are out there fighting. And the United States created ISIS during the invasion of Iraq. What they did when they laid off every military person in Iraq. What did happen? Many of them formed organizations that eventually became ISIS. And so the Kurds were doing the United States heavy lifting to take on ISIS. One of the most brutal.
What should the U.S. have done there? Should we have stayed in northern Syria, and for potentially how long? I know the Kurds were like seeking a Kurdish state. It just seemed like a very sticky situation, and the United States seems like they get involved in the Middle East when they shouldn't be. Do you think that holds any weight here with us trying to kind of leave the situation alone now and finally try to pull out? Because the idea here is, right, to reduce our military involvement overseas and in other places, but now we're upset when Trump pulls out. So what's the angle here?
Well, I'm a pacifist, and so I look at it from what is the worst case or less worst case scenario? As a pacifist, I can go and tell a Kurdish.
Don't you think maybe a strong American military can help quell different small conflicts around the world, or a big American military leads to more conflicts? Because that's what I know our American policy is supposed to be: rule from a position of strength to help stop these smaller conflicts from occurring.
I've already mentioned that the United States is supporting Saudi Arabia. That should answer your question. The U.S. military is an imperial army. It's Pharaoh's army. They're not going to bring about. If you want to bring about less conflict, well, let's use the United Nations for what it's all about. That's what we have to do.
Sure. I mean, how many wars has the United Nations stopped, though? Like, off the top of my head, I can only think of the UN pulling troops out of areas before wars were about to begin. Right? So when has the UN ever stopped any actual war? I mean, we could talk about that, but the U.S. acts as the UN, I think, in many cases.
May I ask you, are you a Palestinian?
I'm not a Palestinian.
You're not a Palestinian.
No.
You
didn't ask me what I am, though.
Well, that's somewhat irrelevant because you answered my question.
All right.
You're not Palestinian. The Palestinians have gotten something because you got a United Nations. United Nations.
What did the Palestinians get? Didn't seem like, if anything, it feels like the UN kind of screwed them over.
No, the United States, what the Trump administration has done to the Palestinians, probably the worst crime they...
Wait, what did Trump do to the Palestinians that's worse than any other administration in the past has done to the Palestinians? Because look, we could rail on Trump when necessary, but...
Were you around when George Bush Sr. was in the White House?
I was.
Okay, well, do you know that George Bush Sr. in the White House condemned the settlements in Israel? Do you know that?
Off the top of my head, no, but I
Right,
guess now
yeah.
I do. Trump condemns the settlements too, as I believe.
No, come on, nobody would.
Trump told Benjamin Netanyahu to stop building new settlements. So we could wink, wink, wink. But you can only take him at his word, because just how we're mentioning George.
No.
That's one person
Trump,
you really can't take at his word.
He shut down the Palestinian office right here in D.C. He moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. I could go on and on. Sure. What has happened to...
Well, Israel identifies their capital as Jerusalem. But just quickly in conclusion, was there anything else you wanted to mention?
Well, I just want to say is we really got to get together the peace and justice movement with the climate movement, because unless we stop the Pentagon from continuing its dirty work, we're not going to save Mother Earth. And
Absolutely.
I appreciate the chance for talking to you
Thank
today.
you so much for your time, sir. I appreciate it.
No
Thank
problem
you.
at all.
Thank you. An Impeach Trump sign. Behind me, we have the White House, and then we have some protesters to my left.
Button here.
You also have this button. It says, resist and impeach the traitor. So can you tell me, why is Trump a traitor?
Well, to begin with, he's been stealing from the taxpayer for more than 60 years.
Yeah. For over 60 years, what has he been stealing? How has he been stealing from the taxpayer?
Been a tax cheat and a draft dodger. Of course, dodging the draft for a conscientious issue I'm not concerned about that, but he didn't do it for a conscientious issue. Having bone spurs at 20 years old is bullshit.
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you ever have bone spurs?
No, never.
You ever know somebody that has bone spurs?
No.
Well, you should check it out.
Is there anything, so a lot of Democrats are talking about impeachment at this point. There's the Russiagate scandal, there's Stormy Daniels stuff, feels like a lot of people forgot about that. There are his taxes now that he hasn't released. There's Ukraine Gate. What do you think is the Democrats' best case for impeachment?
All the above.
Sure, but they should focus on one thing moving forward, right? It shouldn't just be a catch-all.
They could focus on what he's done to the federal workers.
Mm-hmm. What has he done to the federal workers?
He's oppressed them.
How so? How has he oppressed these guys?
Well, what he talked about whistleblowers, what he talked about federal judges, federal prosecutors, police officers, what he's done to the Veterans Administration.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask about this most recent case, because you did mention the whistleblower. Do you think it's important to know the identity of the whistleblower?
Why?
Why? Just to see if there's any biases. I mean, who the person is, right? I mean, if there was a whistleblower who could get the president impeached, we should know who he is, right?
Why?
Why? To see to see their backgrounds, right?
Why not look at the truth?
We should look at the truth, but doesn't that involve the truth too?
No, that doesn't involve the truth.
Yeah. I know in the transcript there said there was no quid pro quo. Do you think there was quid pro quo involved in the Ukraine scandal?
Trump has lived off quid pro quo all his life. That's the basis of his shakedowns all his life.
I also know one of the things he was complaining about amongst this Ukraine stuff was that Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, was getting paid on some Ukrainian gas board. Do you have any qualms or concerns about that?
Well, if the State Department did not find any proof of that, well, the deep state did not find any issue there.
Yeah. Is this like the sort of
It's just like the Hillary issue.
Yeah.
If the deep state did not find anything to go after Hillary about, then that's that.
Do you think it's befitting of a vice president, though, to have his son go work on foreign exec boards? This soft type of corruption where, Joe Biden's son wasn't qualified for this job, and he still got it.
I don't know what qualific. That's like, who knows what that qualification is?
Sure, no, but he was generally unqualified for this job on this Ukraine exec board. You don't think it's a little bit odd that the VP's son may be working on a foreign exec board?
I don't like it.
Okay, good. Because two things could be true at once, right? Like, that could still be bad.
Yeah, that could be bad, but the fact about fracking in the world today, we can't deal with the fracking done here in America.
Absolutely.
That's we shouldn't export poison around the world. That's true, but we have to deal with issues here in
the U.S. Yeah.
The stuff floating down the Potomac River here is a problem that we have to deal with.
Yeah. I had one last question for you. I know we've been hearing a lot about Jeffrey Epstein in the news recently. What do you think happened to Jeffrey Epstein?
Well, the Donald has connections in the jail there, and I really can't say I never been able to do that.
Do you think he killed himself? Do you think Epstein killed himself?
I really don't know.
That's a good answer.
I wish the issue is the due process has been destroyed by people like Trump.
So we're out here today. Behind us, we have the White House, and then closer here, we have some protesters. Some were Impeach Trump protesters, some were Impeach Trump protesters, some were climate change protesters. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you're out here, what it means for you to be out here?
Well, I'm an activist, and at some point I'll be arrested for this action, but for both things, really. I'm a former marine biologist, and so it's mostly about the climate. And what I appreciate is different tactics that are applied to the climate issue, because we've got a fundamental existential problem. And I really appreciate it when people like, high-end celebrities bring more
Jane
people.
Fonda,
Jane
Ben and
Fonda,
Jerry's
yes,
guys.
absolutely. Jane Fonda is bringing more attention to the issue simply because of her celebrity. So all of these different lights are applied to an existential problem, and that's why I'm here. I live outside of D.C.
What do you think are some big-ticket items that we could kind of attack to help address the climate change issue?
You mean as far as policy?
Yeah, because as I understand, too, we need to reduce our emissions to zero within the next 10 or 20 years or so to really have a good grasp at trying to help, reel in some of this climate change. So what could we actually do to have a big impact here?
Well, that's a real big question. Yeah. I think the only way to really do it is to have fundamental change. We have to have a regime change.
You think it's necessary for a regime change, like the government necessarily? Why?
I say that metaphorically.
Oh, okay.
I don't say this like the warring in the rest of the world. I say that in terms of a regime change in the mind.
Oh, okay.
Even corporate Democrats don't support what really needs to be done. if we're going to tackle the emissions problem. And I think it's up to the United States to begin that, to attack the emissions problem.
I know we had more progressive Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez propose the Green New Deal. Some said it kind of just sounded like a progressive wish list because there was a lot of stuff on there. One of the things to help reduce to net zero was not the use of planes or cars anymore within 10 years. Do you think that's a feasible thing to not have any of the gas cars that we have or gas planes? So like, do you think it's bad that we're setting these goals that might not be feasible?
Well, you're kind of, that's a leading question, but I agree with you that we're going to have to tackle a bunch of different elements, and I don't think we're going to be able to do it with just cars and transportation. People have a tendency to think that it's the transportation that constitutes most of carbon emissions, but it's actually how we grow our food.
Agriculture, I know, contributes for around 10% of the U.S. CO. No, that you think I'm wrong on
Much
that?
more than that.
Okay.
Well, I don't think you're wrong. I think that there's lots of misinformation out there, but that's kind of the area that I concentrate on. The way we grow our food, the fact that we till the soil, the fact that we still use fertilizer. There are many things that cause, emissions. And I think that it's much more than 10. I don't mean to contradict you, but
no, that's fine.
I've heard it's 50% is agriculture
I don't know if it's
worldwide.
Sure, yeah. I wanted to bring up that idea of worldwide, and this will kind of be the final question. I know the U.S. contributes around 15 to 20% of the world's CO2 emissions year over year. On a per capita basis, that's really high. But on a percent of global CO2 emissions in the world, it's only around 15 or 20%. How do we convince other countries like China or Brazil or countries in the EU to hop on board with us? Because this is a worldwide problem that if other countries don't hop on board with us, it won't really matter in the grand scheme. So how do we encourage those countries to join in with us?
Well, there's a differential issue there, which means that most of the CO2 that's been pushed in the atmosphere over the last 100 years is the EU, England, and mostly the United States. So we need to allow the other nations, the developing nations, to grow for their middle class. But
at the expense of using CO2 emissions that is killing our planet?
Well, no, their contribution is much, much less historically. Much less. So if you take Bangladesh, for example, it's a fraction of a percent. India is getting more simply because of the bulk of their population, and so is China. But I think if the United States leads, China is doing much more in terms of mitigation.
Let's say the U.S. got to zero. Let's say the U.S. was around 20%. We'd still have around 80% left of the current year-over-year emissions. And according to a lot of people who are trying to get to net zero within 10 years, it just seems like, might not be the right solution.
We're not going to get to net zero by 10 years. Net zero
is ridiculous, and I'm glad people are willing to admit it might be a little bit of a pipe dream. I think it would be ambitious to reduce our emissions by a quarter.
If we start now, but if we get to net zero and completely go cold turkey on the fossil fuel,
which isn't even an option. Yeah.
We're going to collapse economically. More people will die. What we need is a 50-year plan, not a 10-year plan. And a lot of people, I'm glad you understand this. A lot of these don't understand that.
I was scared to bring it up.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm not a scientist, but I'm studying the economics of it, studying the whole globe, what's the word? The global aspect of it, because it takes so many elements to do this.
100%.
It really is going to be, and that's why I would urge you to look into the agriculture.
Sure, and I will confirm my number. I believe it's around 10%, but I'll look it up and confirm.
Depends on where you're getting that from.
Sure. No, I mean, other sources say industry's a large part of it, transportation's a large part of it, buildings, but people using electricity. All of our electricity is a derivative from, plants nearby burning coal and stuff like that. But one last actual question in conclusion.
Okay.
Does nuclear energy have any role in pivoting off of fossil fuels?
I believe it does.
Okay, great. And now quickly in conclusion, was there anything else you want to mention?
It does. I think if it's done safely, if we have smaller units, regional units, local units, that can be monitored, and maybe even, I don't know about cold fusion, but yeah, I think the only way we're going to make the transition and not have civilization collapse is to throw the dice and introduce nuclear back into the picture.
Absolutely.
So I was totally against that when I was a younger guy.
Yeah.
But now looking at it, I think the only practical way is to distribute the kinds of power like nuclear and wind and solar, but wind and solar won't even begin to be able to solve the problem.
That's I can't believe you knew that too, though. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that.